I knew you'd come back.
The storm outside was relentless. Heavy sheets of rain lashed against the massive glass windows of The Blueprint, blurring the amber streetlights of Chicago into bleeding streaks of gold. A sudden, violent flash of lightning illuminated the empty cafe tables, immediately followed by the deep, vibrating rumble of thunder. Inside, however, it was a quiet sanctuary. Nora moved gracefully between the heavy wooden chairs, a damp cloth in her hand. The melancholic, soothing notes of a vintage jazz record spun on the turntable, filling the dimly lit space with a familiar warmth. It had been a long, exhausting day of serving customers, but the rhythmic motion of wiping down the tables brought her a profound sense of peace. The storm outside only made the cafe feel more alive, yet perfectly serene. The sharp, sudden chime of the brass door knocker sliced through the jazz melody. A gust of freezing wind swept into the cafe, bringing with it the harsh scent of wet asphalt. A man stood in the doorway. Water dripped heavily from his soaked hair, pooling onto the polished hardwood floor. He wore a heavy cashmere coat, now completely ruined, smeared with thick city mud and clinging to his shivering frame. It was David. He slowly pushed the heavy door closed, shutting out the howling wind. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and trembling. He stood there for a long moment, letting his weary eyes sweep across the room. He saw the exposed brick walls. He saw the vintage drafting tables used as coffee counters. He heard the exact jazz record that used to play on loop so many years ago. The entire cafe was an exact, living replica of the very first architectural blueprint they had ever drawn together. A slow, exhausted breath escaped David's pale lips. A look of overwhelming relief washed over his face. He looked like a fragile man who had lost his way in the dark, only to finally find a beacon of light. He had lost everything out there in the storm, but looking around this room, it felt like he had finally found his way home. David dragged his muddy leather shoes across the pristine floor, making his way toward the main counter. Behind the bar, Nora had not stopped moving. She stood with her back partially turned to him, slowly and methodically polishing the gleaming copper of the vintage espresso machine. He stopped just inches from the counter. He lowered his tired shoulders, looking like a man who had carried the weight of the world and could not take another step. "Nora," he whispered. His voice was deep, breaking with genuine exhaustion. "I am back." The cloth in Nora's hand stopped moving. The jazz record crackled softly in the tense silence. Slowly, deliberately, Nora lifted her head. She turned to face him. There was no sudden gasp. There was no widening of her eyes. Her gaze was as still and impenetrable as a frozen lake in the dead of winter. Her voice, when she spoke, was as gentle and soft as it had been 5 years ago. "I knew you'd come back." Behind her, the copper espresso machine suddenly hissed, releasing a sharp, violent jet of hot steam. The bitter, burnt scent of dark roasted Arabica beans hit the air, harsh and overwhelming. And just like that, the sharp scent dragged Nora's mind backward, plunging her straight into the vibrant ghosts of 7 years ago. The air in her memory wasn't filled with the smell of an impending storm, but with the sharp, dusty scent of graphite and cheap, burnt diner coffee. It was 3 a.m. inside a cramped, dimly lit architectural office. The small room was suffocatingly warm, and the floor was practically buried under mountains of crumpled tracing paper, empty sugar packets, and discarded blueprints. Nora sat cross-legged on the floor, her hair tied up in a messy, careless bun, a yellow pencil tucked behind her ear. She was physically exhausted, her fingers heavily smudged with dark charcoal dust, but her eyes were burning with an undeniable, electric brilliance. She was the genius, the quiet, relentless visionary who could look at a barren patch of dirt and see a living, breathing masterpiece. But her brilliance was fragile, often hidden behind her natural introversion. That was where David came in. He was the voice that made the world believe in her. He sat across from her, leaning heavily against a dented metal filing cabinet, loosening his cheap, frayed silk tie. He was holding a slice of cold, day-old pepperoni pizza in one hand and a cracked styrofoam cup of black coffee in the other. He took a sip, winced at the bitter, acidic taste, and gently passed the cup to Nora. She took it, their fingers brushing in the dim light. They shared a tired, deeply intimate smile. They had no money. They had no wealthy investors. But sitting together in that chaotic, cramped little room, they felt entirely invincible. "They're going to love it," David said, pointing to the sprawling, intricate blueprint spread across the coffee table. His voice was magnetic, filled with that intoxicating raw confidence that could sell ice to a blizzard. "You designed a masterpiece, Nora. I just have to make them open their eyes and see it." The scene shifted smoothly, the flickering fluorescent lights giving way to the blinding, golden hour of a setting sun. They were standing on the exposed rooftop of their very first major project, a half-finished mid-rise commercial building. The wind whipped fiercely around them, tugging violently at Nora's thin trench coat. All around them was the raw, unpolished skeleton of the city: exposed steel rebar, towering wooden scaffolding, and rough, gray concrete. But to them, standing side by side, it was a castle. David stood near the edge, looking out at the sprawling Chicago skyline. The brilliant orange and deep purple hues of the sunset painted his face. He turned to look at Nora, and the fierce, hungry ambition in his gaze completely melted away, leaving only pure, unadulterated adoration. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing heavily against the hollow concrete floor. Without a single word, David suddenly dropped to one knee right there in the construction dust and rubble. Nora gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. David didn't reach into his coat pocket for a velvet box. They couldn't afford diamonds, and he knew she didn't care about them anyway. Instead, he reached down to the dusty concrete and picked up a heavy silver metal washer left behind by the framing crew. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, looking up at her with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "I swear to you, Nora," David whispered, his voice steady and full of absolute certainty. He reached out and gently took her trembling, cold left hand. "Someday, I'm going to build you a skyscraper, and our cafe will sit right at the very top." He slowly slid the cold metal washer onto her ring finger. It was slightly too big, heavy, and rough, but to Nora, it was the most beautiful thing in the entire world. David looked deeply into her tear-filled eyes, his grip on her hand tightening. "We are never going to sink." The memory of that dusty rooftop faded into the bright, flashing lights of cameras. Their wedding was a beautiful blur of champagne, laughter, and the warm embraces of friends and family. For 2 years, their marriage was a sanctuary of mutual respect and unbreakable partnership. They moved into a luxurious, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline. They were a team. They were unstoppable, until the real estate market violently collapsed. The financial crash hit their firm like a tidal wave. Almost overnight, the vibrant, bustling architectural office turned into a graveyard of canceled contracts and screaming phone calls. Nora refused to surrender. She sat at her massive drafting table at 4 a.m, her eyes bloodshot, furiously redrawing blueprints to salvage failing projects. When the company accounts dried up, she quietly unlocked her velvet jewelry box. She sold her diamond earrings and her grandmother's vintage necklace just to make payroll for their panicked staff. She looked toward the door, waiting for her partner, her husband, to walk in and fight beside her. But David was rarely there. When he did come home to the penthouse, his face was drawn, his eyes avoiding hers. The magnetic energy he once had was replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. He stopped asking about the firm. He stopped offering solutions. One evening, exhausted and desperate, Nora spread a stack of final notice bills across the marble kitchen island, begging him to help her strategize. David did not even look at the papers. He poured himself a glass of scotch, his jaw tight with irritation. "Do whatever you want," David snapped, his voice echoing sharply in the massive, empty kitchen. He loosened his silk tie and turned his back on her. "I have absolutely nothing to do with your downfall." He walked straight into the bedroom and shut the heavy oak door, leaving Nora standing completely alone in a sea of red ink. That night, lying in the dark beside her sleeping husband. Nora noticed his phone light up on the nightstand. She reached over, her hands trembling slightly. She typed in his passcode, their wedding anniversary. Incorrect password. A cold, heavy knot formed in her stomach. She stared at the glowing screen. The man sleeping next to her was no longer the man who had knelt in the construction dust. He was slipping away, mutating into a stranger. 2 weeks later, the terrifying truth materialized. Nora was walking back from a desperate meeting with a bank officer when she passed a high-end, exclusive steakhouse. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw him. David was sitting in a dimly lit, velvet corner booth. Sitting intimately across from him was Victoria, the 35-year-old heiress to a massive steel empire. Victoria was arrogant, pragmatic, and dripping in inherited wealth. Nora stood frozen on the wet sidewalk. She watched as David leaned across the table, his hand resting familiarly on Victoria's waist. He smiled, that same magnetic smile he used to reserve only for Nora, picking up a piece of dessert and gently feeding it to the heiress. When Nora confronted him in the penthouse that night, David did not flinch. He did not apologize. Instead, he twisted reality with terrifying ease. "Are you insane, Nora?" he yelled, throwing his coat onto the sofa. "I am out there begging for capital to save our firm. I am trying to help you, and you are throwing a pathetic, jealous tantrum?" She wanted to believe him. She tried to believe him. But the final, fatal blow came on a Tuesday morning. Men in gray suits arrived at the architectural firm, placing heavy padlocks and foreclosure notices on the glass doors. The company was dead. As Nora stood numbly in the hollow, echoing office, a courier walked up and handed her a thick manila envelope. Her hands shook as she tore it open. Inside lay a stack of divorce papers, already signed in David's bold, aggressive handwriting. Beneath the legal documents was a thick, gold-embossed envelope. She pulled out a wedding invitation. "Victoria and David request the honor of your presence." Tucked at the very bottom was a grim financial summary. David had secretly liquidated their joint accounts, funneling the remaining capital into offshore shell companies to protect himself. He had taken everything. The only asset he had deliberately left in her name was a worthless, crumbling brick warehouse on the edge of the city, the very building she was standing in now. Nora dropped the papers to the floor. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. The background noise sounded like a luxury airport lounge. "David," Nora whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "You took everything." "Love does not pay off a $10 million debt, Nora," his voice came through the speaker, bone-chillingly calm and completely devoid of empathy. "Keep that old brick warehouse. It is my final act of kindness." The line went dead. The sharp, rhythmic scrape of a metal trowel against concrete was the only sound in the cavernous, empty room. Nora wiped a thick streak of sweat and gray dust from her forehead, her breathing heavy and labored. The air inside the abandoned brick warehouse was thick with the suffocating smell of dry cement and old rot. She was entirely alone, kneeling in the rubble, her clothes stained, using her raw, blistered hands to mix a heavy bucket of wet mortar. Suddenly, the sharp, unmistakable click of designer heels against the cracked floor broke the silence. Nora slowly looked up. Standing in the center of the debris, looking utterly disgusted, was Victoria. She wore a pristine, cream-colored silk trench coat and carried a crocodile leather handbag that cost more than the entire ruined building. The cloying, overpowering scent of expensive floral perfume aggressively pushed away the smell of the damp dust. Victoria looked down at Nora, her perfectly painted lips curling into a sneer of pure, condescending pity. "He was right," Victoria said, her voice echoing sharply off the bare walls. "This place is a grave, and you look perfectly suited for it." Nora did not say a word. She slowly stood up, her joints aching, brushing the heavy dirt from her denim work pants. Victoria reached into her designer bag, pulled out a thick, paper-banded stack of $100 bills, and carelessly tossed it onto a nearby pile of broken bricks. "Take it," Victoria commanded, crossing her arms. Relocate. Start a little flower shop in a different state. Just get out of Chicago. It is pathetic, Nora. You lingering around like a stray dog. It is an eyesore. Do not dirty my husband's eyes anymore." A heavy silence hung in the damp air. Nora looked at the stack of cash. She did not scream. She did not cry. The agonizing betrayal of the past weeks had completely burned away all her tears, leaving behind nothing but a cold, terrifying focus. Slowly, deliberately, Nora walked over to the bricks. She picked up the stack of money. She walked right up to Victoria, closing the distance until the heiress instinctively took a nervous half-step back. Nora grabbed Victoria's wrist and pressed the money firmly back into her soft, perfectly manicured hand. Victoria flushed with anger. "How can hands covered in mud," she spat, trying to regain her arrogant composure, "ever hold on to a man born to fly as high as David?" Nora looked directly into Victoria's eyes. Her gaze was entirely dead, heavy, and unshakable. "I am an architect, Victoria," Nora said, her voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "I work with foundations. Be careful with the tower you are living in." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but the chilling, absolute authority in Nora's voice paralyzed her. Without another word, the heiress turned on her heel and practically fled from the warehouse. Nora did not watch her leave. She turned her back to the door and walked straight to her bucket of mortar. She plunged her hands back into the abrasive mix, ignoring the sharp, biting sting as the rough concrete tore the skin on her knuckles, making them bleed. She was not broken. She was rebuilding. Over the next year, Nora slowly transformed the ruined warehouse into a beautiful, thriving cafe. The town whispered that she was a lunatic, meticulously recreating the exact aesthetic of the architectural firm she had lost, playing the same old jazz records, buying the exact same vintage leather chairs. They thought she had gone mad, building a tragic, desperate shrine to the man who had destroyed her. They were entirely wrong. Nora kept the design because it was her design. She loved the exposed brick walls. She loved the melancholic jazz. She had built that aesthetic with her own brilliant mind and her own two hands. She absolutely refused to destroy the things she loved just because a coward had walked away from them. She was not preserving his memory. She was honoring her own survival. The violent hiss of the espresso machine abruptly severed the memory, snapping the timeline sharply back to the present. The rich, warm scent of dark roast filled the golden-lit sanctuary of the cafe. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the man standing on the other side of the mahogany counter. David was a ruined, shivering mess of soaked cashmere and street mud, dripping freezing rainwater onto the pristine floor. He leaned heavily against the polished bar, gripping the edge until his knuckles turned white. He lowered his head, forcing a desperate, broken tremor into his voice. It was the performance of a lifetime. "She took everything, Nora," David choked out, his voice thick with rehearsed agony. "Victoria. She stripped the company bare. She hid the assets, filed for bankruptcy, and threw me out onto the street like garbage." He let out a hollow, bitter laugh, shaking his head as if the betrayal was unimaginable. "I lost it all, but hitting absolute rock bottom, it finally opened my eyes." He looked up at her, letting his eyes brim with manufactured, shining tears. "The whole world out there is nothing but lies and transactions. You were the only real thing in my life. You were the only one who ever truly loved me." Nora stood perfectly still behind the counter. She didn't say a word. Encouraged by her silence, David took a slow, deliberate breath. He leaned closer across the bar, his eyes pleading and wet with remorse. Slowly, he raised his cold, trembling hand, reaching out across the counter to gently cup her cheek. "Let's start over, Nora," he whispered, his voice incredibly soft, dripping with manipulative desperation. "Please, let's just start over." His hand hovered in the empty space between them. He waited for her to lean into his palm. He waited for her stoic facade to break, for the tears to fall, for the desperate embrace of a woman who had waited 5 long years in this dusty tomb for his return. But Nora did not lean in. She did not flinch away. She did not cry. Instead, she simply looked at his hovering, trembling hand. Her dark eyes were not filled with rage, nor were they clouded with lingering heartbreak. They were entirely, devastatingly blank. She stared at him with the chilling, absolute indifference of a person looking at a stranger's forgotten umbrella left out in the rain. In that deafening, heavy silence, David's grand illusion completely shattered. Slowly, seamlessly, Nora took a half-step backward. David's trembling fingers grasped nothing but empty air. His hand slowly dropped to his side, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his pale, exhausted face. Nora did not explain. She simply turned, picked up the small, porcelain cup of freshly brewed espresso, and placed it gently on the wooden counter between them. The dark, bitter liquid steamed in the dim light, the sharp aroma filling the heavy silence. Then, she looked up at him. The edges of her mouth curled upward into a soft, perfectly serene smile. "I knew you'd come back," she repeated, her voice light and effortless. David exhaled a heavy sigh of relief. He completely misread the smile. The confusion melted from his face, quickly replaced by that familiar, arrogant certainty. He took a sudden, eager step forward, throwing his arms open to finally pull her into a desperate, clinging embrace. "Stop." The word was not shouted. It was spoken softly, yet it carried the chilling, absolute authority of a judge handing down a final, inescapable sentence. David froze in his tracks. Nora reached into the deep pocket of her canvas apron. She did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe away his tears. She pulled out a thick, legally bound stack of papers, stamped with a heavy blue notary seal. She slid the document across the polished mahogany bar, stopping it right next to his steaming cup of espresso. David stared at it. His eyes darted to the bold, capitalized letters printed at the top of the page: "Deed of sale and transfer of ownership." "I knew you would come back tonight, David," Nora said, her voice dropping to a low, conversational whisper. "Not because you missed me, not because Victoria threw you out, but because you are drowning in toxic debt and you are desperately trying to acquire the South Loop mega project to save your own skin." David's face went entirely bloodless. His jaw went slack. The rehearsed sorrow vanished from his eyes in an instant, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. "This cafe," Nora continued, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail against the solid wood of the bar, "sits directly in the dead center of that commercial zone. It is the core parcel. You needed my land to close your massive real estate deal. You came back tonight to manipulate me into signing it over to you for free." David's breathing turned shallow and erratic. He frantically scrambled to pick up the contract, his wet, muddy fingers staining the crisp white paper. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he read the signature, printed boldly at the bottom. "I sold the land, David," Nora stated, her voice as smooth and cold as glass. "2 hours ago, to Richard Sterling." The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Richard Sterling was a ruthless billionaire and David's most cutthroat corporate rival. With this parcel in his possession, Richard just legally triggered a hostile takeover of the entire South Loop project. He swallowed your final development whole. You aren't just bankrupt anymore, David. You are now on the hook for millions in defaulted commercial loans that you can never, ever repay. The crushing reality of his total destruction crashed down on him. The cafe, the vintage aesthetic, the old jazz music, it wasn't a tragic shrine to their lost love. It was a perfectly laid, 5-year trap, and he had walked right into the dead center of it. "You tricked me!" David screamed, his voice cracking violently. He slammed his fists against the counter, the pathetic veneer of the victim completely shattered. "You kept this place exactly the same for 5 years. You kept it all for me." Nora looked at him, utterly unmoved by his explosive outburst. "I kept it to remind myself never to be weak again," she replied, her tone chillingly hollow. "This waiting wasn't for you. I waited here to personally kill the legacy you were most proud of." She gestured elegantly toward the porcelain cup on the counter. "Your coffee is getting cold, Mr. Former Chairman." The morning sun broke over the Chicago skyline, brilliant and blinding. It burned away the grim, heavy clouds of the overnight storm, washing the city streets in a crisp, golden light. The melancholic, quiet jazz that had haunted the corner of 4th Street for 5 years was gone. In its place was the deafening, vibrant roar of progress, the sharp whine of power drills, the rhythmic pounding of heavy hammers, and the loud shouts of a demolition crew echoed down the block. David stood paralyzed on the opposite sidewalk. He looked like a ghost lingering in the daylight. He had not slept. His expensive coat was dry but hopelessly stained, his face hollow and unshaven. He stood completely still, his bloodshot eyes wide as he watched his final delusion being systematically ripped apart. Workers were carrying the heavy, vintage leather sofas out the front door, tossing them carelessly into the back of a massive disposal truck. Through the shattered front windows, David watched a man pry the framed, original blueprint off the exposed brick wall. The paper tore, fluttering to the dust-covered floor, forgotten. The dark, moody tomb was dead. The workers had already knocked down the partition walls, allowing massive amounts of natural sunlight to flood the space. They were painting the dark bricks a crisp, airy white. It was no longer a shrine to the past. It was a completely new, modern design. The heavy shell of David's arrogance finally cracked, completely shattering into dust. The undeniable truth stared him in the face. Nothing in that building belonged to him. It never had. Just then, Nora stepped out of the cafe's front doors. David's breath hitched in his throat. She was a complete contrast to the broken man standing across the street. Nora wore a beautifully tailored, cream-colored trench coat, her hair styled effortlessly. She pulled a sleek, silver carry-on suitcase behind her. She looked rested. She looked radiant. Desperation seized David's chest. He stumbled across the street, dodging a passing car, and practically threw himself in front of her. "Nora," he choked out. She stopped. She did not recoil. She simply looked at him. David's hands shook wildly. The charismatic, manipulative CEO was gone, leaving behind a terrified, empty shell. He looked at the construction workers, then back to her, his voice cracking with pure, agonizing regret. "I was wrong," David begged, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "I was so completely wrong. I threw away the only person who ever truly valued me just to chase an illusion. I destroyed the foundation of my own life." He reached out, though he didn't dare touch her. "Hate me, Nora. Please, hate me for what I did, but please, don't erase everything we built. Don't erase us." Nora looked into his weeping, desperate eyes. There was no anger in her gaze. There was no mockery. There was only the profound, unshakable calm of a woman who had fought her way out of hell and survived. "It is good that you finally realize your mistakes, David," Nora said, her voice smooth and entirely even. "That realization will serve you well in whatever is left of your life." She took a slow, deliberate breath, the morning breeze catching her hair. "But for me," she continued softly, "that apology expired 5 years ago." Nora reached into her coat pocket. She stepped forward and gently took David's trembling hand, turning his palm upward. With a quiet grace, she placed a small, cold object into the center of his hand. David looked down. It was the heavy, rusted metal washer, the exact same washer he had picked up from the construction dust 7 years ago to ask her to marry him. "I am not erasing the past, David," Nora said, her eyes bright and incredibly clear. "I am just cleaning it up. I have to make room for my future." She slowly let go of his hand. Without another word, Nora turned her back to him. She walked toward the bright yellow taxi waiting at the curb. As she grabbed the door handle, a brilliant, breathtaking smile broke across her face. The crushing, suffocating weight of the last half-decade lifted from her shoulders, dissolving into the crisp morning air. She slid into the back seat. She never looked back. The taxi pulled away, disappearing into the bustling city traffic. David's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the cold, hard concrete of the sidewalk. He clutched the rusted metal washer tightly to his chest, lowering his head as violent, hopeless sobs racked his entire body. He had nothing left to manipulate. He had nothing left to sell. Behind his trembling, kneeling figure, 2 workers carried the heavy, wooden "The Blueprint" sign out of the cafe and tossed it straight into the metal dumpster with a loud, final crash. High above them, a crane hoisted a gleaming new steel framework into the morning sun, catching the light as a brilliant new chapter officially began. Sometimes, the hardest part of moving on isn't letting go of the person who hurt you, but letting go of the future you built in your head. Nora chose to rebuild her foundation, not for revenge, but for her own survival. What would you have done in her place? Would you have offered forgiveness, or would you have walked away to start anew? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales of difficult choices, complex relationships, and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. Until next time.